She said I didn't belong. The sirens proved otherwise, and one false trespassing call unraveled an HOA empire when my credentials surfaced under flashing lights in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. Let me start from the beginning. The house had been mine for 6 months, long enough for the mortgage payments to feel routine and the creak in the hallway floor to feel familiar. It was a neat 2-story in a manicured suburb where lawns looked identical and mailboxes stood like obedient soldiers. From the outside, it was the kind of neighborhood that advertised safety and order as its main amenities. Inside, it was simply home. That afternoon began like any other. The sun hung low, casting warm light across the driveway as I unloaded groceries from my trunk. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and someone else's barbecue. I was wearing jeans, a hoodie, and my hair pulled back, blending into my own sense of comfort rather than the neighborhood's unspoken expectations. Nothing about the moment suggested conflict. Nothing about it suggested danger. The Homeowners Association had made itself known early on, of course. There were letters about lawn height, reminders about trash bins, and thinly veiled warnings about approved paint colors. It was the kind of HOA that thrived on control disguised as community standards. I had complied, mostly out of convenience, partly out of curiosity about how far the rules would go. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly suspicion would replace courtesy. As I carried the last bag toward my front door, I felt eyes on me. Across the street, a woman stood rigidly near her mailbox, posture stiff with purpose. She was the kind of person who looked permanently prepared to report something. Her gaze followed me with a precision that felt rehearsed. I registered her presence, then dismissed it. Existing in public while black had taught me which looks were worth my energy and which were not. I never made it inside. Police cruisers rolled into the cul-de-sac with a suddenness that shattered the calm. Red and blue lights bounced off windows and windshields, transforming the serene street into a scene charged with accusation. Neighbors emerged from their homes, curiosity blooming faster than concern. Lawns became viewing galleries. The officers approached with caution that felt disproportionate to a woman holding grocery bags. Their body language told a story before any official explanation arrived. Somewhere in the background, the HOA president hovered, her certainty practically radiating. A call had been made, a report filed, a narrative constructed. The accusation was simple and devastatingly familiar. A suspicious individual was allegedly trespassing on private property. A person who did not belong was attempting to access a home in a neighborhood she was not recognized as part of. The implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. I stood on my own driveway as my identity was questioned without words. My home loomed behind me like a witness that could not testify. The groceries grew heavier in my hands, not from weight, but from the absurdity of the moment. This was not confusion. This was entitlement meeting prejudice. The officers did their jobs by the book, requesting identification, surveying the scene, scanning reactions. One of them ran my information. Another took note of the growing audience. The HOA president remained close, her confidence unwavering, certain she had done the neighborhood a service. What she did not know was that scrutiny was my profession. When the system returned my information, the atmosphere shifted. The officers' posture changed, their attention redirected, no longer centered on me as a potential problem, but on the situation as a whole. The casual assumption of wrongdoing evaporated, replaced by procedural awareness. My credentials did not scream for attention. They did not need to. Years of federal service had taught me that authority rarely needed volume. It only needed verification. The realization moved through the scene like a quiet shockwave. The accusation that had seemed so safe moments earlier now carried consequences. A false report was no longer a neighborhood nuisance. It was a documented event with legal implications. The HOA president's certainty faltered, replaced by visible recalculation. Neighbors retreated, suddenly busy, suddenly uninterested. The performance was over, and the ending had not gone as expected. As the cruisers eventually pulled away, leaving behind whispers and awkward glances, the street returned to its curated calm. But something fundamental had cracked. The illusion of harmony had been exposed for what it was: conditional, selective, and fragile. I finally stepped inside my house, groceries in hand, knowing the story was far from over. The accusation had been made, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The next chapter would not take place on the driveway, but in the corridors of authority where false assumptions carried real weight. The quiet after the police left felt heavier than the confrontation itself. The house absorbed the silence, walls holding the echo of flashing lights and unspoken judgments. Outside, the neighborhood resumed its routine with forced normalcy, but the tension lingered like humidity before a storm. False police reports were not a misunderstanding. They were a misuse of resources, a deliberate act that redirected attention from real emergencies. In my line of work, I had seen how those reports escalated situations that never needed escalation. I had seen how easily assumptions became statistics. Documentation began immediately, not out of spite but out of necessity. Patterns mattered, intent mattered, and the HOA had a history of overreach that suddenly deserved a closer look. Within days, the incident found its way into official channels. Body camera footage existed, call logs existed, written statements existed. The narrative was no longer controlled by neighborhood gossip or HOA newsletters. It was preserved in reports that did not care about property values or community image. The HOA president attempted damage control. Notices were circulated about safety and vigilance, carefully avoiding mention of the accusation itself. The language was sanitized, stripped of responsibility. The implication was that the situation had been handled appropriately. It had not. A formal inquiry began, not because of who I was, but because of what had been done. The call was specific. The description had been unnecessary. The insistence had been telling. It was the kind of report that relied on stereotypes to fill in gaps where facts were absent. The officers involved were professional, but even professionalism could not erase the initial bias that framed the encounter. That, too, was noted. Accountability did not stop at the HOA boundary. Neighbors who had watched silently now avoided eye contact. Others offered tight smiles that attempted friendliness without apology. A few seemed genuinely unsettled, realizing how easily any of them could become the next subject of suspicion if they deviated from expectation. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. The tone shifted from authority to anxiety. Legal counsel was consulted. Policies were reviewed. The word liability entered the conversation with uncomfortable frequency. The president's position, once reinforced by confidence and control, became precarious. Her actions were no longer framed as community leadership, but as personal judgment masquerading as responsibility. The distinction mattered. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed with methodical precision. Past complaints were examined. Patterns emerged. There were previous reports involving delivery drivers, contractors, and visitors who did not fit the neighborhood's unspoken image. Each incident had been brushed aside as vigilance. Together, they formed something else entirely. The realization rippled outward. The HOA's authority was not absolute. It existed within the bounds of law, not above it. And when those bounds were crossed, consequences followed. The neighborhood felt different now. Lawns were still trimmed, mailboxes still aligned, but the certainty that had once defined the space was gone. People hesitated before watching too closely. Curtains twitched less frequently. For me, the experience was exhausting but clarifying. It reaffirmed a truth I had always known but never wanted confirmed so close to home. Belonging was conditional in places built on sameness. Ownership did not guarantee acceptance. As weeks passed, formal notices arrived. Interviews were conducted. The HOA president's actions were scrutinized not by neighbors but by authorities uninterested in preserving appearances. The story was no longer about a single call. It was about power and its misuse. The inevitable outcome loomed. Resignations were discussed, penalties considered. reforms proposed. The HOA's carefully maintained image was unraveling thread by thread. What began as an attempt to assert dominance over a perceived outsider had triggered a reckoning, and the final chapter would determine whether the neighborhood learned from it or simply replaced one gatekeeper with another. The conclusion arrived without drama, the way most real consequences do. There were no public apologies shouted across lawns, no dramatic confrontations under streetlights. Instead, there were official letters, legal findings, and quiet exits. The HOA president stepped down. The resignation was framed as personal reasons, but the timing told the real story. The investigation's findings had made her position untenable. A false police report was not a lapse in judgment. It was an action with intent, and intent carried weight. The ownership association underwent mandatory training. Policies were rewritten to emphasize limitations rather than authority. Reporting procedures were restricted, requiring evidence instead of suspicion. The language of the bylaws shifted from control to compliance with the law. Some neighbors welcomed the changes. Others resented them, viewing the outcome as an overreaction. The divide was subtle but present. It always was. For me, life returned to a version of normal that carried new awareness. I walked my street with the same posture, but the space around me felt altered. The eyes that once watched with certainty now hesitated, unsure of their footing. The incident became a cautionary tale whispered in community forums and online groups. It spread beyond the cul-de-sac, beyond the neighborhood, serving as a reminder that assumptions could backfire spectacularly. Ownership papers still bore my name. The house remained mine, but the experience left an imprint deeper than property lines. It underscored how quickly privilege weaponized itself when unchecked. I did not seek revenge. I did not need to. The system worked precisely because it was designed to address misuse of power, not personal vendettas. The accountability was structural, not emotional. The neighborhood slowly adjusted. New leadership took over the HOA, quieter and more cautious. The culture shifted, not out of enlightenment, but out of fear of consequence. It was not ideal, but it was effective. As time passed, the story lost its immediacy but not its relevance. New residents heard it secondhand. Old ones remembered it when tempted to police someone else's existence. I remained, not because I needed to prove anything, but because the house was still home. The experience had not driven me out. It had clarified my resolve. In the end, the greatest lesson was simple. Mind your business, respect boundaries, understand that authority does not come from assumptions. Because sometimes the person you accuse of not belonging knows the law better than you do.